My family always saw me as a walking ATM, but when my father banned me from his party because my child ruined his aesthetic, he made a fatal mistake. He thought I was his clerk, but he forgot I was his auditor. While he was ordering vintage wine, I was freezing his accounts on fraud charges. He thought he was kicking me out of the family, but in reality, he had just signed the papers for his own exile. Now, I'll tell you how I turned his private study into a nursery for my daughter. I was going through a stack of structural assessments when my phone buzzed against the dark oak of my desk. It was my father, Arthur, checking in about his 60th birthday dinner that evening. I had expected a mundane detail about the seating chart or the wine selection. Instead, the words on the screen made my pulse go cold. Do not bring that child. An unclaimed brat is a social liability I cannot afford to showcase. He had just called my 4-year-old daughter, Chloe, baggage. I didn't drop the phone. I didn't cry. I simply felt a sharp, icy clarity settle into my bones. The air outside in Colorado was biting, the kind of dry cold that stings the lungs and forces you awake. I walked down the driveway, my heels striking a rhythmic, hollow sound against the frozen asphalt. I didn't look back. I didn't glance at the golden light spilling from the windows, where my family was likely raising glasses to their own perceived perfection, finally rid of the daughter who never quite matched their curated aesthetic. They probably imagined me sobbing at the wheel, a mess of heartbreak and defeat. They were wrong. I wasn't broken, I was recalibrated. I sat in the driver's seat of my sedan and locked the doors. The silence was heavy, like the air in a courtroom before the judge speaks. I didn't start the engine. I reached for my laptop on the passenger seat. The screen flared blue in the dark, casting a ghostly light over my face. My hands remained perfectly steady as I tethered to my hotspot. It was a few minutes past 8. By midnight, their world would look very different. I logged into the banking portal first. For 3 years, I had been the silent architect of Arthur's lifestyle. When his engineering firm collapsed under the weight of his own ego, I stepped in. I didn't make a scene. I just set up an automatic transfer. Every month, $4,000 left my account to satisfy his mortgage lender. He never thanked me. He never even acknowledged it. He simply absorbed the money as if it were a birthright, a tax I paid for the privilege of his shadow. I stared at the scheduled payments tab. The next one was due in 48 hours. I moved the cursor. The screen blinked once. Recurring payment deleted. The safety net was gone. He was likely enjoying a dry-aged steak in a house that was now technically in default. Next, I opened the administration portal for the Marshall Family Trust. This was the detail Arthur always overlooked. He was the beneficiary, but because of a history of reckless speculation, the bank had mandated an independent administrator. He had signed that power over to me 5 years ago, too disinterested in the tedious paperwork to realize what he was giving away. He thought I was his clerk. He forgot I was his auditor. I scanned the recent activity. A pending withdrawal for $75,000 sat there, scheduled for the 2nd of the month. The memo read capital investment, which was his code for high-stakes poker debts, and a down payment on a luxury SUV. I didn't decline it. That would have been too loud. Instead, I flagged the transaction. Reason: suspicious activity, potential fraud. I clicked Freeze Assets. A crimson banner slashed across the screen, account locked pending investigation. Only the administrator could unlock it, and she had just checked out. Then, I thought of the desk. When my mother passed, the reading of the will had been a theater of greed. My sister, Beatrice, got the jewelry. My father took the liquid assets and the estate. I was left with the antique rosewood writing desk from the study. They laughed when the lawyer read it. They called it kindling. They didn't know the secret my mother and I shared. That desk had a false bottom in the center drawer. It wasn't empty. It held the ledger. For a decade, my mother had documented every cent Arthur had skimmed from her inheritance, every forged signature, every illicit wire transfer used to mask his failures. She had been too frightened to leave him, but she was brilliant enough to forge a weapon for the one who would eventually have to fight. She left me the gun. Tonight, I decided to pull the trigger. I closed the laptop. The blue light vanished and I was back in the dark. I started the car. As I pulled away, I caught one last glimpse of the house in the rearview mirror. It looked grand, a fortress of old money and prestige. But from where I sat, I could see the rot in the foundation. I shifted into drive and headed for the main road. The temperature gauge read 20 degrees, but for the first time, the cold didn't bother me at all. I drove on autopilot, my mind drifting back to that house, to the table, and to the faces of the people I had spent my entire life trying to appease. Why had I stayed so long? Why had I endured the subtle barbs, the dismissals, and the suffocating sense of being less than? I thought about those circus elephants I'd read about as a child. When they are young, they are tethered to a small wooden stake with a thin rope. They pull and struggle, but they aren't strong enough to break free. Eventually, they simply stop trying. As they grow into massive, powerful creatures, they could easily snap the cord or yank the stake from the earth with a single shrug. But they don't. They stay tethered because they believe they are still weak. They are held captive not by the rope, but by the memory of it. For nearly 30 years, I had been that elephant. I had been conditioned to believe my worth was tied strictly to my utility. I was valuable only when I was solving a crisis, paying a bill, or fixing a disaster I hadn't caused. My sister, Beatrice, was the artist, the fragile, free spirit who couldn't be burdened with the banality of responsibility. Arthur was the visionary, a man whose grand ideas always required an infusion of cash but never yielded a return. And I was the reliable daughter. The one with the steady career, the healthy savings, and the credit score they treated like a communal resource. I remembered when Beatrice totaled her car a few days before her 21st birthday. Arthur had called me in a panic, not to ask if his daughter was hurt, but to ask if I could cover the insurance deductible because things were tight. I paid it. I didn't even ask for the money back. I just wanted to be the hero. I wanted him to look at me with the same pride he reserved for Beatrice. He never did. The rope held. I remembered when Arthur borrowed $15,000 from my retirement fund to invest in a friend's startup. He promised to repay it with interest within 6 months. That was 4 years ago. When I brought it up last Thanksgiving, he laughed and told me I was being petty about family money. The rope tightened. Tonight, at that dinner table, the cord finally snapped. It wasn't just the insult that did it. It was the silence. The absolute, suffocating silence that followed when I shared the most important news of my life. In that moment, I saw the truth with agonizing clarity. They didn't love me, they loved the vacuum I filled. They loved the safety net I had woven for them. The second I became a person with my own needs, a life of my own, I was discarded like an outdated model. I glanced at the passenger seat where my bag sat. Tucked inside was the ultrasound photo I had planned to show them, a tiny, grainy image of a new life. My child. A fierce, protective heat washed over me. I would not let this baby grow up tethered to a stake. I would not let them learn that love is a transaction. I steered onto the highway ramp, merging into the stream of traffic. The city lights blurred into long streaks of red and white against the dark. I wasn't just driving away from a disastrous dinner, I was driving away from a lifetime of conditioning. The realization was terrifying, but it was also exhilarating. The stake was gone. The rope was broken. For the first time in my life, I was truly, completely free to go wherever I chose. I reached for my phone and dialed the one person I knew would understand. Aunt Sarah picked up on the second ring. Nora? Is everything all right? No, I said, my voice steady and clear. Everything is over. And everything is just beginning. Christmas morning at Aunt Sarah's cottage was quiet. It smelled of cinnamon rolls and strong coffee, a sharp contrast to the performative opulence of my father's estate. There were no mountains of designer gifts, no catering staff hovering in the background, just Sarah in her thick flannel robe, pouring me a mug of tea while the heater hummed softly in the corner. It would have been perfectly peaceful, except for my phone. It had been vibrating against the kitchen counter for 3 hours. I didn't silence it. I wanted the record. I wanted to see the exact moment the consequences finally collided with their reality. At 9 in the morning, a voicemail notification chimed. I put it on speaker so Sarah could hear. It was Arthur. "Nora, you ungrateful little thief. I just got an alert from the bank. The trust account is locked. Who do you think you are? That is my money. If you don't unlock it in 5 minutes, I'm calling the police. I will have you arrested for embezzlement. You think you can just walk out of here and sabotage this family? You are nothing without me. Fix this." His voice cracked at the end. It wasn't the roar of a lion anymore, it was the squeal of a cornered rat. Sarah looked at me, her eyes wide with alarm. "He's going to call the police, Nora." "No," I said calmly, taking a slow sip of my tea. "He knows he can't. If he calls the police, they'll ask for the financial records. And if they see the records, he goes to prison for fraud. He's bluffing because he's terrified." A second later, a text flashed on the screen from Beatrice. She was supposed to be checking into a luxury resort in Lake Tahoe this morning, a trip she'd booked on the family credit card, the one I quietly paid off every single month. Card declined. Are you kidding me? I'm standing at the front desk with my friends, and this is humiliating. Fix it now. Dad says you did something to the accounts. You're ruining my Christmas. You are so incredibly selfish. I looked at the messages, the threats, the insults. For years, these tantrums would have sent me into a blind panic. I would have scrambled to transfer funds, to apologize, to smooth things over just to keep the fragile peace. But today, looking at the screen, I didn't feel a flicker of anxiety. I felt like a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. "Why does he hate you so much?" Sarah asked quietly. "You're the only one who ever helped him. You saved him. Why did he throw you away?" I looked at my aunt, the steam from my tea curling between us. "Because I know the math. I realized last night that it wasn't about the baby or the family image. It was about insecurity. My father has spent his entire life wearing a mask, the brilliant businessman, the wealthy patriarch, the ultimate success story. Everyone buys into it. Beatrice buys it. The neighbors buy it. But I don't." I leaned back, the truth feeling light in my chest. I see the ledger. I see the debt, the bad decisions, and the stolen money. I am the mirror that reflects his failure. Every time he looks at me, he sees the daughter who had to bail him out. He sees the competence he lacks. My stability makes him feel chaotic. He didn't disown me because I was a disappointment, he disowned me because I was the witness to his fraud. He had to cut me out to protect his ego. He prefers the fantasy of being rich and wronged over the reality of being bankrupt and rescued. I set the phone down on the wooden table. "He's an empty suit," I said. And he just realized I took the hanger. I stood up and walked to the window. The snow was falling harder now, blanketing the garden in white. "He threatened to sue me for theft," I told her. "Let him try. I have one more gift for him, and he's going to open it today." Sarah watched me as I began organizing a stack of documents I'd brought in my bag. She looked terrified, not for herself but for me. She still saw Arthur as a titan, a man who could crush anyone who crossed him. She didn't realize that the titan was standing on trapdoors I had installed 3 years ago. Nora, she said softly, tracing the rim of her mug. I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. Please be careful. Arthur has powerful friends. He talks about his angel investor all the time, the private equity group that bought his debt when the bank tried to foreclose back in 2020. He says they believe in him. He says they gave him an unlimited timeline. If he calls them. I stopped shuffling the papers. A small, cold smile touched my lips. He can't call them, Sarah. Because they don't exist. She frowned, leaning forward. What do you mean? He showed me the letterhead. Meridian Capital. They saved the estate. I saved the estate, I said evenly. Meridian Capital is a shell LLC I registered in Delaware 3 years ago. I am the sole managing member. I am the board of directors. I am the angel investor. Sarah went silent. Her eyes darted from my face to the laptop, trying to process the magnitude of the situation. When the bank moved to foreclose, I continued, Dad refused help from his daughter. His pride wouldn't allow it. So, I gave him a story he could accept. A prestigious firm that saw his potential. He signed the loan agreement without reading a single word of the fine print. He was too busy admiring his own reflection. I slid the document across the table and pointed to the guarantor clause. Sarah read it, then froze. He didn't just disown me last night, I said. He triggered an immediate default. By kicking me out, he legally evicted himself. I told Sarah how I had crafted a narrative he could swallow, a prestigious firm that believed in his unrealized potential. He had signed the loan agreement without a second glance, too enamored with his own reflection to bother with the fine print. I pointed to the specific guarantor clause on the page. He didn't just disown me, I said. He triggered a terminal default. By cutting me out, he effectively evicted himself. Sarah whispered the words on the document, her voice trembling. A notice of acceleration. Full repayment in 48 hours. I leaned back in the kitchen chair. I hadn't deceived him, I had simply relied on his narcissism. He was so certain that I wasn't worth the effort of careful reading that he'd handed me the keys to his undoing. He thought this was a domestic squabble. It was a liquidation. On New Year's Eve, he showed up at Sarah's door. He looked older, the bravado stripped away by the biting wind and the reality of a frozen bank account. You own the house, he said, his voice raspy and hollow. I own the debt, I corrected. You own the consequences. He tried his usual weapons, accusations of betrayal and claims that I was a cold-blooded daughter. I simply reminded him that I had been the one keeping his life from collapsing while he prepared to strike me from his will. When the anger failed, he reached for sentiment. He mentioned my pregnancy, trying to use the child he had called a social liability as leverage for mercy. No, I said. You don't get to use my child to refinance your failures. I handed him a thick manila folder. This wasn't a negotiation, it was an exit strategy. Inside was the deed to a modest, fully paid property in Arizona, and a monthly stipend, contingent on one non-negotiable condition. He signs over the estate, waives all future claims, and agrees to permanent, total non-contact. You're exiling me, he said, his hand shaking as he looked at the pen. I'm offering you a graceful exit instead of a public eviction. Take the dignity I'm handing you. He signed. The house became mine, but I didn't keep it as a monument to him. I transformed it. I stripped away the heavy drapes and the pretentious, dark furniture. I repainted the rooms in colors that caught the winter sun, and turned his mahogany study into a bright, airy nursery. I wasn't erasing the past, I was correcting the narrative. On New Year's Day, I hosted a dinner for the people who actually mattered. There was no hierarchy, no performative toasts, and no catering staff, just warmth, shared laughter, and a table I had chosen myself. I finally understood that victory isn't about groveling for a seat at a table where you aren't wanted. It's about building your own, and deciding exactly who is invited to sit down. This wasn't just a structure of stone and wood anymore. It was finally a home.